everyone, readers and followers of the Arab Hospital magazine. We are glad today to have with us Dr. Elena Bottazzi, Associate Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine, Professor of Pediatrics and Director of Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development and Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. Welcome, Dr. Bottazzi. We are glad to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Mirna. It's a pleasure to be with all of you.
Thank you. Today we are going to discuss the COVID-19 vaccines and to set the record straight on some of the claims we are hearing circulating on social media about the vaccines. So we're going to ask you everything that people are asking about the COVID-19 vaccines and where we are today from this pandemic.
Absolutely. Ready to go.
So my first question, we hear that the COVID-19 vaccine is not safe because it was rapidly developed and tested. So what can you tell us about this?
Well, first of all, we have to remember at some level, we have been quite lucky that the virus that it's circulating is from a coronavirus family. And the reason why we were able to really deploy multiple, indeed, even interventions as well as knowledge is because coronaviruses are not new. And I think this concept that people think that we started creating a vaccine from scratch, from no prior learnings or even experience, it's not true. We have almost 15 years, if not more, of knowing about coronaviruses. We've had actually 2 other outbreaks, as you know, one specifically related to Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome. So it's been amazing how all the learnings from these last 15 years were really probably one of the main reasons why we were so quick in advancing a vaccine in your question, right? That contributed with also adding that in the last 15 years, we've also have now much better technologies. Yes. So we sequence the virus a lot quicker. During the SARS, for example, it took months to get the sequence. For the SARS-CoV-2, it took only less than a week. We already, for example, also had very large clinical networks that we were ready to deploy, certainly the trials and evaluation. Lots of money, as you know, were also added to the pot to do some activities in advance. So, for example, one of the major reasons is that we advanced the manufacturing, and companies were producing potential vaccine lots at risk, not even knowing if they were going to work. So overall, I think it's not true, and it's really doing a disservice to the community thinking that it's been a quick turnaround time. But the reality is that we've already had at least 15 years of evidence experience. And that's why if you use that, that's the reason why in less than 12 months, we were able to deploy something pretty quickly.
So, Doctor, can you tell us what kind of vaccines are now available in the market? We know that the FDA approved 2 vaccines till now, the Pfizer-BioNTech one and the Moderna one. So can you tell us what are the vaccines available? And if you can tell us also what are the differences between all these vaccines? We are hearing about the AstraZeneca. Maybe it will get approved soon, and maybe the Johnson & Johnson one. Can you tell us more about these vaccines?
Yes, absolutely. So first, I think we need to make sure we're clear. There are no approved or licensed vaccines yet.
It's an emergency approval,
Right. So what we have is emergency use authorizations, which still mean that in some level, they're still considered experimental. And I think at some level, it's also good because even though we will always, even after they become fully approved or licensed, there's continuous safety assessments, and there's of course continuous intent to expand, innovate, and do more clinical evaluations, right? So as you said, you're correct. The ones that are authorized for emergency use, for example, in the US, it's only Moderna and Pfizer. In the UK, you have Pfizer and also the AstraZeneca, right?
Right.
In Europe, you have the Pfizer. So the authorizations are, of course, region, country specific. The fact that maybe we have an authorization for Moderna in the US doesn't necessarily mean that it's authorized somewhere else. And therefore, you're right, in other regions of the world, especially, low middle income settings or Southeast Asia, the MENA region, it's really dependent on, at some level, the country approvals. We know that there are some vaccines that, for instance, are not approved in the US. For example, the Chinese vaccines may have authorization in other regions, or the Russian vaccine. Overall, I think you're right. What the difference is that what we need to, of course, be also a little bit cautious is who's really authorizing them and what kind of stringency these regulatory agencies have. Some agencies, of course, are much more stringent. The top, I guess what we call the Cadillacs of the regulatory are the European, the Japanese, the US. Some other agencies maybe are still strict, but not have all the stringency. And so we need to also understand, who is approving and how are we allowing therefore those vaccines to then, for instance, be even exported and used in another region. And here comes the role of the World Health Organization. They have a system called a pre-qualification of vaccines. And the aspiration is that eventually for us to have very clear, strict quality is that each vaccine manufacturer, when they have an aspiration of exporting vaccines to other regions of the world, also seek their review and their approval through the WHO pre-qualification process. So many things still a little bit on the move. But I think, as you mentioned, vaccines such as the Johnson & Johnson, the AstraZeneca, certainly Pfizer, Moderna, even though they have some challenges in their ability of really getting deployed in certain regions because of the cold chain. We have to look at what will be suitable for what country, what could be suitable for which populations. We also have an enormous work to still do in the area of manufacturing and, of course, having the inventory and how this inventory will be distributed. There's the COVAX program, which of course is the program, for arguably the equity distribution and access. So we still have a lot of work, but for now, I think I would focus on what each of your countries are doing. Who are they relying with regards to the regulatory reviews and approvals? And therefore, what is the landscape of options that we have? And right now, they may not be that many options yet because there's not a lot of approvals. But I think in the 2021, this is where during each of the quarters, we're going to see more and more companies submitting their dossiers for review and hopefully increase the access and delivery.
So can you tell us about the mRNA technology that Pfizer and Moderna used? Because it's a new technology. It's never been used in a vaccine before. Can you tell us more about it? And how can we know that it's safe and it doesn't, because we hear that it gets to it maybe gets to the DNA of the person. Is it true or not? Can you tell us more about this, please?
Sure. So first, again, I think people have this perception that, yes, it's correct that there has never been a licensed vaccine using an RNA technology. And in that example, we also have not had any viral vector vaccines that have been licensed before. But that doesn't mean that RNA technology has not been evaluated and has not been looked at before. In fact, we indeed have already a drug has been licensed and approved using an RNA technology. And of course, as you could infer, is a cancer therapy, right?
Okay.
We also know that RNA vaccines have been evaluated before in clinical trial settings. For example, for rabies, we have had also trials with an RNA vaccine against Zika. As you know, there's, the fact that they may not have reached the point of certainly widespread knowledge or even use is because, as you know, there's sometimes a reduction of interest and funding, or the fact that, the pandemics or the outbreaks disappear and therefore the interest, shift. So again, the notion that they're new technologies is of course true, but they're not as new of all of the sudden. Where did they come out from, right?
The research started many years ago.
Many years ago. So we have also, again, a body of evidence that already have alerted us that it would, of course, be a good option. And again, we really lucked out that for the coronavirus, it actually had not only the interest, the funding, and of course, the ability of moving it forward. Now, your question about, what does it really do in our bodies? And I think if you remember the basic biology, right, we all have DNA. DNA is a code, DNA gets translated into an RNA. The difference is that DNA certainly lives in our nucleus. RNA already is out in our cytoplasm, and it's practically the machinery to eventually produce what we call the proteins. So everything in our body starts with a DNA, changes into an RNA, which is then becomes proteins. And that's the impetus of the vaccine. So there is no way that an RNA vaccine converts back into a DNA, first of all.
Okay.
The RNA doesn't go into your nucleus, so it cannot get inserted into your code. And it's very quick, right? It's very quick in the machinery of our cells to make this RNA sequence to become a protein. And what's really inducing your immune response, and it's really what the vaccine does, is that the RNA becomes a protein, and the protein is the one that's producing the presentation for the response. Same with the viral vectors. The viral vectors are kind of mock viruses, non-pathogenic, that they, when they get into your body, they produce proteins and then they present them. Or the protein-based vaccines, which basically use directly for you to get a vaccine in your body, and then that protein is presented to your immune response. So I have to say that scientifically, biologically, there's a lot of misinformation also about the components, and whether they have chips, and whether because people call them genetic codes. There's a lot of misinterpretation in the wording, but the reality is that in fact it's a very normal process. Our bodies are very used to seeing an RNA and converting it into a protein. It's not a process that it's exhaustive. Once it happens, that's it. And that's the reason why they seem to be very good.
So, doctor, do you advise people getting any kind of vaccine available in their country? I mean, for example, in the Middle East, we know that Pfizer is arriving to the Middle East. They are using also the Chinese vaccine. So do you advise people anywhere in the world to get the vaccine available in their country?
The answer is an absolute yes. Because first of all, if you really notice, all the vaccines, whether they're, again, full live, attenuated, inactivated viruses, pieces, using RNA or proteins or whatnot, we were very lucky that we knew that the soft target of this virus is this spike protein or a piece of the spike. And even if you're protected, and I know we're going to talk about variants, and we're going to talk about other things, it's clear that for us to be able to, one, ensure that we don't get sick, and clearly that we don't want to get very severely sick to the point where we go to the hospital and potentially even intensive care and die, the best we can do is try to reduce, again, the symptomatic clinical symptoms. And that's what these vaccines do. And whether they do it with an efficacy of 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, to be quite honest, is better than 0%, right? So, and in fact, now we even just published a paper where, look, waiting for something later, waiting for something that's better, waiting for when you have, more options to choose from, it's going to be not as safe. And we're going to continue seeing two things: that we cannot reduce the virus circulating in the communities, and we're actually pushing the virus to take an opportunity to continue mutating. And that's the reason why we're seeing that the virus is gaining advantage in transmission, right? Advantage that is becoming more transmissible. So I urge, if you qualify and if you are privileged enough to get access to one, there's so many countries, so many people, so many regions that we don't even get to that point yet. So if you do have access, don't hesitate. Talk to your physician if you have questions. They are safe. Like with any medicine, of course, nothing is 100% out of risk. But if you balance the risk of the disease, of the natural virus infection, and the risks you may get from certainly getting a vaccine, knowing now that there's millions of people, not only in trials, but also because it's being used now through these authorizations, you have to understand that the number of potential events or concerns is so low, one person in a million, that it's not worth it. So please go get the vaccine if you have access.
And doctor, which lasts longer, immunity after COVID-19 disease, if someone gets the disease, I mean? We know that it has some immunity after the infection, or protection from the vaccine, which do we know which one lasts longer than the other?
So look, natural immunity, we know definitely does exist. But again, some people do have a natural immunity, and that's why they, of course, recover or possibly even are asymptomatic. And clearly there's people who don't, and that's why, of course, we have so many deaths. So it's not standard, right? We don't even know what makes a person have a real good natural immunity versus a person who doesn't. And that's the trick, right? You're playing a Russian roulette game here, where you can't say, well, maybe I will be on the group that will actually induce a good response and become protected. Vaccine immunity, it's actually designed to the point where we really target it also. So not only you attempt to make it more directed towards the pathogen, you're also hoping that these vaccines also can induce more longer and durable immunity, right? Even though we're learning more and more. So generally, vaccine-induced immunities are much better than, of course, natural immunities, right? Now, this also will come into play with the fact that we're already seeing that, even though at the beginning we were not that concerned that maybe you indeed could get reinfected, there were cases, but not very widespread. Now that we have these variants, we are very sure that because if you had already prior infection with, let's say, the original virus, and now you get exposed, especially to the strain that arose from South Africa and probably will be spread outside of South Africa, that variant is not allowing your natural immunity to protect you. And of course, we're already seeing that some vaccines, the protection also is reduced. Fortunately, the protection from the vaccines, especially those that have very high protection, anything above 60, 70%, even if you get the other strain, you're still probably going to be able to manage it. That said, we're not, of course, saying, okay, we're done. We're always going to look for new vaccine, I guess, designs at the same time, how you can potentially even boost the vaccination strategy. So there's many options that we can work on, But I think today the key is avoid getting yourself infected, because we don't know what's circulating, and therefore wearing masks, distancing is still, priority.
Yeah.
And if you can add, to your tool of, protection, a
The
vaccine, also do that, because all the toolbox that you have access to, the different tools, is the ideal to use them all in combination.
So after how many days or months, for example, a patient with a COVID-19 disease that has got over this disease should get the vaccine? Is it he can get it immediately after, or he should wait? Because they are saying that they should wait 3 months at least if they had severe symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
Is it true?
So look, it's controversial, right? You're right. Some people are saying, if you got an active symptomatic disease, right?
Yeah.
That you should wait like the 90 days, like you said, the 3 months. But honestly, I have to say it really depends on how indeed your immune response had responded to that, symptomatic disease. And I know that probably it's not that they're recommending that you get, evaluated to see how much antibodies you have, from that infection, to determine when to get the vaccine. So I think
because the test is not available for everyone.
And so I suggest that, certainly you always consult with your physicians. Certainly those who are delivering and distributing the vaccines can also guide you. Certainly the public health, in our case, for example, whatever CDC recommends, in the MENA region, all your different public health offices probably also can recommend. But I suggest that, as much as how you can, even if you did get the disease, you of course have to wait until you're recovered, that you have no more symptoms. And probably definitely at least, after at least, I don't know, maybe certainly a couple of weeks after you're cured and you don't have symptoms, look, explore, discuss, and decide indeed when is the best time for you to get the vaccine. But the recommendation is that even if you have had the exposure before,
you should get the vaccine.
You should get the vaccine.
And doctor, why do we still need to wear masks and social distancing even after the vaccine? Everyone is asking, because we were waiting for this miracle vaccine to come up so we can go out again to get our normal lives again. So why the recommendations are still to wear masks and to keep social distancing like before, even if you get the vaccine?
Right. So I think there's several reasons why we have to do this. So first is the fact that these vaccines have been evaluated specifically to ensure that we can get protected against the clinical symptoms, right? Meaning the actual disease. That for us is the most priority, right? The highest priority. People that would have gotten sick if they get exposed, they don't get sick anymore.
Okay.
As a secondary objective, of course, you also don't want you to be able to even get infected at all, right? Sure. But we already know that probably these vaccines don't really protect you from infection. Most likely true, you will not probably get as high as an infection, and certainly your body would prevent that the virus, of course, replicates, and therefore you become also probably less infectious, right? But there's the likelihood is that even if you're vaccinated, you may still get infected, you may be asymptomatic, and therefore you probably are still transmitting, right, to others. And that's the reason why you still have to not only protect yourself, because even if you got the vaccine, you just don't want to get infected, right?
Sure.
And most importantly, if you do get infected,
others.
You don't want to get, others to get infected, especially those that have not been able to get the vaccine anymore. So I think that's the reason why we still need, so it's not like it's an immediate replacement tool, right? It's a tool that needs to be added to the toolbox, use it, as we see that more virus gets reduced, that we, of course, don't see that more people are vaccinated, that's the other thing. We need a lot of people to be vaccinated before we can start removing the masks. So that's important.
What percentage do you think the population should be vaccinated to get the herd immunity in the population everywhere,
yes,
in every country?
And the bad news is that we need a lot of population, meaning at least 2/3 of any country's population. And right now, we have to clarify that these vaccines are only approved for either 16 or 18 years of age and above. So at least 2/3 of all the population that are within that age range, right? We know that we're going to have to eventually deal with the population 18 years of age and below, and that's why we now have to also strive to see how these vaccines can be evaluated in the pediatric and even the younger population, because we don't want to leave them being the carriers and the transmitters of the virus. But right now, the most important is reduce the deaths and certainly prevent disease in the age ranges that are the most affected and the most at risk. And therefore, for that to happen, we need to cover at least 2/3 of any country's population. So around 70 to 80%.
And doctor, why do we need 2 doses now from the vaccine? And is it possible to need more doses in the future? For example, every year, like the flu vaccine, for example. Do we have any information about that?
Yes.
Or we are still the research is still going on?
Yes. So first, to answer your question about why do we need 2 doses and not only 1 dose? So I think it's because when we, and I have to also clarify, most all the studies were done to evaluate 2 doses. Only that Johnson & Johnson actually has an interesting approach where they just deploy their results of how a 1 dose worked, but now they have an ongoing trial that they're also looking at what would happen with a 2-dose scheme. And what we've been seeing is that when you look at some of the data after all these vaccines like Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca are given after 1 dose, there's variability amongst the population. Some people actually do really good after 1 dose. And that's probably, again, those people who have a very good immune response or immune system. But there's a lot of people that may not. And so what the 2nd dose does is that it just raises everybody to the point where then, it's much more tight. The fact that we have a more harmonized population to have high response or high neutralizing titers and high response. So even though it's true, it may be okay that some of us can get 1 dose while others are getting 2 dose, but the ideal and the studies show that the 2 dose is what makes everybody with a very nice high level. We've seen it, in fact, with J&J. After they saw 1 dose, it's still pretty good, right? They saw, their 60, 70% protection. Now it's going to be very interesting, because if then you give a 2nd dose, do that bring it up to the 90, 95%?
Yeah, of course,
right? So, and not knowing that we now have these variants coming into play, if you have a 90 and reduces to 70, 60, 50, it's still okay. If you have a 60, 70 and it goes down to 50, 40, 30, it's still okay. But of course, it's better if you have the higher, right? And that's the reason, most likely, you're absolutely right. We probably are going to have to do what we call boosters. And reinforcements. Like now, how often, when, it's still a little bit in question, because again, we don't know, again, this new variants or how long the durability of the immunity is. But I think overall, right now, we should not worry about what really we are going to have to do in the future. Right now, let's focus on, let's try to make the vaccines that we need now, increase the production of those that we can, and that we have data and approval.
Because it seems we are in a war, so we have to use everything we got.
And if later we need another boost,
Yeah.
well, good for us that we can actually get another boost, right?
True.
Because I'm a big proponent that, I just, more I get and it protects me more in the
better.
future, of course, I'll do it. So right now, just focus on getting what we need to do now.
Yeah. At least the first dose. Doctor, we are hearing of some side effects from the vaccine, especially Pfizer, because it was used on a larger scale worldwide. The allergic reactions that is happening. Can you tell us about that? And is it dangerous or it's treatable?
Yes. So first of all, I have to remind everyone that like any medicine, right, there's always what we call uncomfortable reactions and even potentially events, right? Starting from the fact that, it's always painful when they inject you any vaccine, right? I think we've seen maybe slightly increase in these initial right after vaccination, like headaches or some
a
little
slight
temperature,
fever maybe also.
slight fever, pain in your arm, and those really resolve very quickly. The only contraindication we've seen that has been certainly highlighted is if you know that you have a severe allergic reaction to components of the vaccine, which is not the same thing of just having severe allergic reactions to anything, right? Dust or food, right? But you're right. I think that, disclosed and monitored, they're clearly something that can be addressed. So right now, we've also even seeing that, if you look at all the millions of Pfizer and Moderna vaccines that may have been distributed, it's very low, even the number of people who do get these severe allergic reactions at the time of getting the vaccine. So I think, again, don't hesitate, speak to your physicians, but unless you really know already that you're really allergic to a very specific component of the vaccine formulation, which I have to say, they're very rare.
So it's not like any kind of allergy?
No.
So if you have like, for example, a asthma allergy, so it's...
No contraindication. And again, that's the reason why now when we're distributing these vaccines, they don't give you the vaccine and you go home immediately. They let you stay for, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, because usually that happens very quickly. And then, we've seen that you can take an antihistamine or, something if indeed, is necessary. But for the overall right now, we're not really seeing anything. And what we may be seeing, that's the importance of reporting, the surveillance, right? There's a lot of these, post vigilance of vaccinations, that each government and certainly countries and the world has. And that's why you have to disclose, because all that information is then collected. And we can say, look, 1 in a million, we've seen these kinds of things. 1 in X, we've seen these other, reactions. So again.
Okay, great. So, Doctor, we were talking about the new variants, like the British, the South African, the Brazilian. So we know that you are saying that the vaccine is still effective on these variants, even though that it may be lower for the South African variant. It was like a more aggressive variant. But do you think the virus will keep on mutating? Maybe it will become stronger than the vaccine. We will need other vaccines in the future, or what do you think?
So very good question. And it's very difficult to say, right? Because I think it has a lot to also do how much we as humans really try to contain this virus, right? What we've been seeing is, if you look at for the most of the 2020 year, we certainly, like any virus mutates, but, the mutation was very modest and very, not very rampant, right? And then something had happened, certainly arising in the South African country, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's just South Africa, right? This is not a country issue, right? This is, right? So in fact, this morning we were really much suggested to, not try to put
to put
a name out of it, right? Because that's not very nice, right? I have to say. So it's the fault of the virus, and I have to say, at some level, it's the fault of ourselves, because we're not really, keeping, a good distancing and masking. So, but we see that, starting in December, the virus took a very rapid advantage, and it's actually a combination of mutations, which indeed is found in what we call the variant that arose in South Africa. One of them also is found, one of these mutations, in the Brazil variant. The UK variant has so it's the combination of the mutation from the UK that we identified, from the mutation of the Brazil, and the fact that they're combined together in the one that we found in the population in South Africa. That combination seemed to be, first of all, not more deadly, thankfully, but definitely more transmissible, right? That we see at least 50% more transmission. And clearly, it's giving an advantage to the virus because it's right where it binds to the receptor in our cells. And therefore, that's one of the concerns we have, that maybe some of these vaccines have reduced efficacy. So the good news is that we now know, right? The bad news is that you're right. That's why we need to use much quicker the deployment of the vaccines before this mutation type takes over in the global population. But at the same time, you're correct. We're now looking at strategies. Do we do bivalent type of vaccines? Do we have to restart from a new one? Can we just come later with a booster? How do we combine things, right? Or how quickly can we deploy in regions that still this variant has not taken over and it's still a minority? So many different factors, and that's more the reason of right now try to ramp up the delivery and the use of the vaccines that we currently
have. And Doctor,
have.
Sometimes we hear that mutation is good for the virus, because sometimes with the mutation, the virus loses its ability to get into our system. Is it true? Is it true that sometimes the virus kills itself by mutating?
Right. I think you're right. I mean, sometimes the virus tries something and is actually not beneficial to it. And of course, it's not advantageous. Those generally don't prevail, right? Because as you know, as any organism, what the virus really is looking is to find its way to the point where it doesn't really kill the host, but it manages to survive in the host, right? And that's how eventually we have these viruses that are what you call the community virus, like, getting a common cold virus. That doesn't necessarily kill us. It makes us sick, and we can certainly manage clinically. And there is indeed the possibility that this coronavirus becomes, maybe not tomorrow, it takes a while by the time these viruses become community viruses, but they can become yet another community coronavirus. As you know, there are already coronaviruses that we have that can cause us common colds. But right now, the challenge is that we're not there yet. And yes, the virus is gaining the ability of being very infectious and transmittable. Fortunately, it's not killing the host more than what we already know it does, but still it kills, right? And so that's the population that we want to make sure we prevent, those who get very severely ill, and that therefore may even end up with very difficult long-term sequelae out of the infection or the disease. And clearly we also want to prevent deaths. So it's, it's a tricky virus, right? It's a nasty virus. And that's why we need to also use all the tools we have to try to block it as much as possible.
Is it true that we need to wear a double mask now for to prevent infection?
You know, to be quite honest, you know,
this is becoming too much for
yeah.
the people.
So look, you know, let me tell you, clearly you have to make sure you know that the mask that you use is a real, you know, like at least a surgical mask, right? Yeah. That you replace it often enough, especially if you're, you know, going outside and yeah. getting
so
potentially
cloth masks.
Right now. I'm a little, you know, like some people are a little overboard, right? Like me, you know, I usually have, you know, the surgical mask, but now there's all these very nice cloth masks that are actually also aesthetically more nice. So I put that on top to make it look nice. And honestly, I even use a shield because, you know, I'd rather be, you know, add more, right? So there's nothing wrong with adding more. Ultimately, I think if you know, the minimum is not actually getting exposed and limit your outside or your, you know, conglomeration with others in crowded spaces. But if you have to, you know, do the best that you can, you know, hygiene, you know, certainly distancing and wearing the masks.
So doctor, can we talk about effective treatments for COVID-19 today? Do we have something that can treat COVID-19? Are we there now? Because we heard, for example, about ivermectin medicine. We heard about colchicine also. We heard about the Regeneron antibody cocktail that were used on President Trump before. So can you tell us, is there anything that can treat the COVID-19?
So look, the real reality here is that the answer is no.
No.
And it's not unusual. I mean, tell me one virus that actually has a successful viral treatment. In fact, no virus infections generally have 100% curative methods, right? We have, you know, compounds that ameliorate the symptoms, you know, as you know, that, you know, you can take, you know, several medicines that certainly can help you manage the symptoms. I know that in the clinical management of this disease, we really have certainly improved a lot. Doctors now know a little bit better how to do and what to do when somebody gets hospitalized. You know, a combination of, you know, not only, for example, dexamethasone and other things. I think what we have to be very clear here, there's nothing that you can over the counter, you know, take to prevent you to get the disease. And so please do not, for example, this concept that you can just go to the pharmacy and buy ivermectin and, you know, start taking it as a prophylactic. You know, you're doing a big disservice to, in fact, those who really need to use ivermectin because it's a drug that it's approved for another purpose. Two, that you actually do not know what you can have a sequelae, because this is not it's a toxic drug, right? And unless you're using it in consultation with a physician for exactly what you're using it for. So, you know, and there could be indications that maybe can work in some settings. It can work. It has to be evaluated in a clinical setting, right? You know, with real evidence. Same for vaccines. You know, how many times we've heard that, you know, if you were BCG vaccinated, you probably have better, or if you take the measles, like, so again, you know, follow your health practices. You know, it's good. Certainly, if you need to get your licensed vaccines, if your kids need to get the vaccinations, you have to get that done, because certainly that allows you to not get sick by other things. But right now, the space of therapeutics, it's still, there's really nothing. Clearly, yes, you have maybe these monoclonal cocktails or monoclonals, but again, those are to be used in the context of the clinician, the clinical practice.
That's
right.
The doctor is using.
Right.
So, doctor, what is your message to the people out there concerning the vaccines? Please, can you tell us? Can you give?
Sure.
A positive message for the people.
Well, look, 2020, it's better than, is worse than 2021, because in 2020, we knew less than what we know now, right? So that's good news. That said, 2021 is going to be a very important year, right? Because we now are starting to see other tools coming into play, right? The vaccines.
Right.
We probably also are going to know more about therapeutics. Ideally, we're also going to improve how well we can contain and trace, right, with diagnostics. But the real message here is that, we scientists, we vaccine developers, the public health physicians, nurses, workforce cannot do it unless each of us individually follow and are and contribute to the battle of this virus. So you have to mask, you have to, if you can, get the vaccine. You have to maintain the distancing. You have to keep the hygiene practices, and just don't listen to all the crazy misinformation that is out there. Follow the science. Trust your health officials, because in the best that they can, they're making, albeit the best decisions that they may, right? But they have to all contribute. We all have to contribute. And clearly, resolving this one country at a time, it's not going to be sufficient. We all have to do this in global collaboration with global diplomacy, because for us to really get rid of this, it has to be done in the entire world, not just if I solve the problem in the US, we're done. Because the likelihood is that I want to go visit my father in Central America, and my father wants to come visit me. So I have to go also and make sure that Central America solves their problem.
Of course, we are living in a connecting world. Yeah. So
yes.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for your time. It was a very informative interview, and hopefully we'll get over this virus in the near future with the vaccine and all the technologies and the science we have. It's a good thing for me, of
Absolutely.
course.
And thank you for the opportunity. And again, my goal is that I can soon get on a plane again and come visit the MENA
of course,
region for sure. I'm a big fan. I love visiting. So I look forward to come and visit you all in person.
Yeah, sure. It will be a pleasure. Thank you very much, Doctor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.